Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Hollywood Breaks. For those of you who are joining us expecting Tim Heindel, unfortunately, yours truly messed that one up a little bit, and he's actually going to be here next week. But do not fret. Robin Geisen is joining me this week as a special guest co-host. And this week we dive into a lot of wonderful topics, talk a little bit about Netflix and the Great Reset. And of course, we couldn't go without talking about CinemaCon and a lot of the goings on that happened in Vegas this past week. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of Hollywood Breaks. Robin, thank you for joining me. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Before I really dive into the show, I do have to offer an apology to our viewers. I got a little screwy on my calendar, and I promised everyone that this would be a Building 88 reunion for those of us who are familiar with Fox terminology. But alas, Tim Heindel is actually on vacation this week. So he'll be with us next week. So mark your calendars now. You'd be thankful I gave you a week notice. And yes, everyone, it does occasionally happen that I do make a mistake. I mean, what can I say? It's rare, but it does happen. So anyway, I apologize again to our viewers, but we still have the wonderful Robin Geisen to join me as co-host, as Tim is off doing something, I don't know what, but hopefully he's having fun. So it's great to have you, Robin. Thanks for joining me. It's always good to see you, have you on the podcast. It's interesting. As I was prepping for today's show, I saw that the Netflix Great Reset, as they're now calling it, is becoming more of a thing than rather just them losing almost $40 billion of valuation in the market. They had started laying off people yesterday. And it seems to me that the great, thought of this company being a great disruptor and the reimagination of entertainment is suddenly coming back to reality, and that it's not necessarily what they originally purported to be. And in fact, they're just another channel of distribution. And I'm wondering, obviously I'm here on the East Coast, you're on the West Coast, so you probably have more of a on the ground feel to what's actually happening. Do you feel like the town is sort of realizing maybe this was just all a great hype, or is it just the nature of the business in general? Just the sort of idea that things start great and then, oh, whoops, now you're coming back to ground? Or is this really just the end of Netflix as we know it, and we're looking at a completely new ball game in the coming months?
I do not think it's the end of Netflix. I think that this was inevitable. It is with, all disruptors, right? There's always a point at which they reach and there's evolution and things change again, right? Just like VCRs were a big disruptor and DVDs were a big disruptor. And there's always going to be something that's going to come in and change the marketplace. I think this was inevitable. I think we knew, look, Netflix took off during COVID because nobody could go to the movies, because nobody had access to any of the other ones. And I will say, streaming across all of the other distribution outlets also was completely amplified and just escalated like crazy, but Netflix was already in place. So I think that they were able to grab everybody's attention right away and just skyrocket because they were already there. They were already built for it. They were built for COVID, right?
Right.
Everybody else, Disney Plus came in, and they obviously now are part of, I think, taking down Netflix, as are all of the other distribution outlets, as you like to call them, because that's what they are. They're distribution outlets. Yeah. Some of them are content creators, but even the ones that don't complete, I wouldn't say Peacock is, but Peacock now has Yellowstone and people are going over there just to watch Yellowstone. There's a lot of these places where, people they're going there for the content, right?
Right.
And so Netflix has put so much money into all of their content, that also, I think, is coming back to bite them in the arse a little bit.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me, and what I totally agree. I don't think Netflix is going anywhere. It is a behemoth. It was a great disruptor in a lot of ways, in a lot of good ways, I would say.
Me too.
But at the same time, it's interesting now Like you had David Zaslav talking on the Warner Discovery, the first earnings call. And now all of a sudden it's like, well, we're not going to spend a ton of money on content. When 6 months ago, that's all it was about. Like, well, how much are you going to spend? How many billions of dollars are you going to spend to feed the content beast? And now it looks like that sort of is shifting now. And the conversation again, and Tim will probably love that I'm saying this, it's now more about quality versus quantity. And the argument could be made that Netflix wasn't always focused on quality. They were more focused on the quantity. They had to feed the beast. They lost a lot of some of their higher serving content or viewed content when they lost The Office and, you know, all the sort of the reruns and whatnot that they had licensed from other studios. And all of a sudden the studios are pulling them back. So that's an interesting aspect of it too. But another part of it that I think is fascinating is Matt Belloni on his, what I've heard, which was, I think, went out yesterday. I read this morning, and, you know, Spencer Klein, who we both know and adore and love, he's a great guy.
Yes,
is now at Netflix, and apparently he and Scott Stuber are running around at CinemaCon, you know, saying how much they're pressing Reed and Ted to start releasing movies in theaters. And I have to wonder if had this great reset, that 40 to 35, $40 billion drop in stock that they experienced because of their subscriber miss, would they even be there if this was the case? I mean, I know Scott Stuber gave that infamous interview where he said, oh, we just need to make better movies. I'm like, well, duh. Like, I mean, who wouldn't say that? But, and maybe less movies. Well, yeah, obviously. Yeah. But I'm wondering if, you know, if that conversation would even be, I mean, listen, you know, again, Spencer Klein's awesome. I have nothing but the utmost respect for Scott Stuber and the career here he's built. But at the same time, would they be there if the great reset hadn't happened?
You know, I think they would. Look, I think they're happy to be there. I mean, I don't know. I haven't spoken to either one, but knowing, you know, knowing Spencer, and he has some of the best relationships with exhibitors. Like, I think this is something that makes him happy to be able to be there and like finally be able to Netflix, I think, was always this like only streaming, day and date. But now, you know, there's an opportunity, and that's how I see it every time. Is it's an opportunity. Like, you shouldn't ever put yourself in this one little place, because then you're only going to be in that one little place, right? And I think Netflix is smart to think of other partnerships, and that's what I mean. I am all in on Netflix partnering with some sort of exhibition outlet and finding a way to work together, because that's what they should have done from the very beginning. I think now the marketplace is kind of forcing them in that direction. I think it's smart to do that. I think Stuber's right. They do need better content. You know, you look at, I guess it was like, I'm trying to figure out when it was. It was about 5 years ago, probably, now with COVID and everything. But I remember listening to Ted Sarandos, and he was saying, he was talking about the percentage of the content on Netflix that was still licensed versus the content that they were making and that people were watching. And 60% at that time, this was 5 years ago, but 60% of the content that was being viewed on Netflix was still licensed. That's a huge percentage. And now with all these other distribution outlets coming back and taking back their content, right? They don't want to license it out anymore, but they've had to let those agreements play out as, you know, as they planned. But now they're getting it all back. And Netflix is forced to create their own content that's just as good, right? So you've got, and like you look at Schitt's Creek is ending its license agreement with Netflix and going to Hulu. You look at all of these, Fuller House is actually a really interesting one too that I saw, where it was Netflix created, right? But now,
produced.
Now it's on GAC. Now it's on cable. Like it's really interesting to see how these are, you know, being created, and it's smart. It's just other ways of distributing your content to more audiences. And that's ultimately what we should be doing. Because don't forget, at the end of the day, what this industry is, it's for the people. It's for, you want the views, not just for money, but like, that's why you create it. That's why we're in, I mean, that's why most of us are in this industry.
I would say that, you know, Richard Rushfield would probably disagree with you somewhat on that.
Maybe.
Even though he would celebrate the idea that, yes, that's why a lot of us get into this industry, although I think there are more people who get into it for the flash of it versus the actual storytelling and making of movies, but that's maybe a podcast for another day.
Yeah.
But his big thing is we are, after all, an industry that's driven by hits. And the idea of what Netflix deems a hit versus, what sort of the more traditional theatrical models, like take Paramount, for example, which has obviously been killing it the last few weeks and for their last few releases, is all of a sudden so committed to theatrical. And the question now is, because sort of the blinders are off Wall Street investors in terms of what Netflix value really is, I think there's going to be more question now of like, okay, well, what I need to see what a hit means to you. Now, I know they share viewer numbers and all that stuff with talent for the most part. And even then they're not exactly as open as I think talent would like them to be. But I think now it's going to, especially if they want to bring advertisers on board, which is a whole nother complicated question, because advertisers are not going to invest unless they can see that it's driving a purchase or driving, consumption by a consumer who views the ad. So there's going to have to be a lot more data sharing, which I'm sure data geeks like Entertainment Strategy Guy are, salivating just to get, peek the books and see what it actually is happening behind the scenes versus, oh, we had, the Red Notice is the most watched movie ever, even though the movie's kind of meh, but it was the most watched movie ever. And it seems to me that they're going to have to prove more what actually is a hit and if they're actually making money. And the flip side of that is also how this is going to affect the other streamers, is they're going to have to start showing, okay, we understand, like Disney Plus, for example, when they announced it, their CFO came out and said, listen, we're looking at least a 5-year loss leader. Like, we're going to be losing money for the next 5 years on this because we're just priming the pump to fill the content void. And now it's going to be like, oh yeah, well, how are you actually going to make money off this? And I think that's what Zaslav is facing now, because he's got $55 billion worth of debt that they've now taken on as part of this merger. His stock has kind of taken a beating. The Discovery stock has taken a beating prior to them actually merging. So he now has to answer to the sort of idea of like, well, you can't spend forever. And I think that's partially why the reset of like, well, we're going to be very smart about how we spend our money. And I think that's a little bit of a pushback on what you said, in that, yeah, they're making content and they're giving it to everybody, but that's ultimately what got the studios in trouble in the first place, because they started just licensing their content to Netflix because it was just another revenue stream that they could bilk, because DVD market was collapsing, international was a little wobbly. So are we looking at the same thing? So I would say that I think Netflix is going to be in a little bit more, and all the streamers for that matter, are going to be a little bit more pressured to show that they're actually making money on this, that it is a revenue driver, and that there is, because again, we're a business of hits, but we're also a business of making money. We are, the keyword being there, business. So business means profit. And you can't just keep making, Scorsese, dream pictures and taking a loss of like 150 million on it and just being like, hey, we got 75 million views. Like, that's just not going to fly anymore.
Well, I will say you're absolutely right. I think I want to touch on two things. One, the transparency, and two, the content itself. So first, the transparency element of it. I want you to be right that they're going to share, that they have to share more data in order to get advertisers on board, but that hasn't necessarily been the case with even online media and digital media spends, right? That's
true.
So I remember sitting in a room and being pitched on the YouTube masthead, and it's this extremely expensive buy, but at the end of the day, it didn't convert, right? On some of the I remember, I forget which the project was. I think it was like Rampage. Rampage was the project. And they were all showing, what they had done and how awesome the masthead looked. And it did. It looked great. The creative on it looked great. However, it didn't convert to the box office. So it was one of those things that I thought, when they're sitting here showing it to me, I said, you should change, like in your pitch, you should find a piece of content that actually worked, that actually converted to box office, right?
Yeah.
So that's one part of it. But it didn't matter because they're still selling it and they're still getting it out. And there wasn't a lot of transparency. So we're kind of in the Wild West, and these companies are able to throw out these gigantic numbers because they can. However, what they don't realize is that they're setting the marketplace. And by setting this new marketplace, because they think they're bringing in a lot more money, they're actually setting everyone up for more failure as well. And I'm going to say that because when you drive those numbers up, and this is where I come back to the content that I want to talk about. And this is where I think Netflix and any distribution outlet has a lot more in common with studios than we all talk about. And in that, I mean, when you start a project off with a budget that's through the roof, when you know who that audience is already, like, you're setting yourself up for failure already. When you have someone coming in and saying they're not going to star in that movie for less than $15 million paycheck, your budget's already starting at $15 million on a movie that is going to open to 20.
Right.
Just because of that one person, right? Like, you think about everything else that goes into this movie, like, we're setting ourselves up for failure again and again and again. And everyone in the industry is responsible for driving those numbers up, right? So, and setting these movies up for failure. And that therein lies the vicious cycle of why it becomes so hard, is because there's a lot of money up for grabs, but just because it's there doesn't always mean that we should take it in that moment, because in the end, like, the movie may not succeed, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, that's where I think we need to really take a step back, and you look at people like Jason Blum. Got that. He understood that, right? And that's why he started making movies for lower budget, when he realized he didn't have to drive the spend up for those movies. He knew exactly who his audience was, right?
Yeah.
Jordan Peele, same thing. Genius, like, who I actually think is one of the most, I think he's the most interesting filmmaker working today. You know,
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Like, he's
one of the most,
and fascinating, and completely and wholly original. And how can you not root for someone who was from Key and Peele to where he right? Which, by the way, I loved Key and Peele. I still love it. Like, I think it's so funny. But it was like, this is the other thing, is we pigeonhole these people in, you know, these stereotypical roles based off of what we think, just because they've played in one part. And we shouldn't do that. And Jordan Peele is a perfect example of you know, of that, of showing what one individual can do, that they're not, you know, just working on one thing. But that's where I think it's like, it becomes this vicious circle, right? Like, you drive the budget up, and maybe you don't need to drive the budget up on that movie. Like, it all starts with audience. It all starts with audience.
You sound like when we had Kevin Getz on, who wrote the fascinating book Audienceology, and you and I have obviously worked with him quite a bit on some of the films we've done in the past. He said very similar things. He's like, you know, it's not that hard. You just have to define the audience, and, you know, look at what's worth spending to grab that audience, and, you know, create the content that you want. I mean, it's interesting. You brought up another point that just reminded me of a meeting we had with Facebook not too long when I was still at Fox. And they presented a trailer for The Accountant, that Ben Affleck movie. And they said, we got so much engagement on this, and it was unbelievable. It was shared like this many times. And Mark Weinstock, who was sitting in the meeting, raised his hand, and he's like, yeah, but that movie didn't open. That doesn't help me. And everyone was just like, okay, this meeting's over.
But he's right. You know, he's right.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it was just like, it was hilarious, because it was just like, they were sitting there bragging about this trailer and how it got shared all over, but I didn't bother to look in to see that the movie actually didn't open. And that's what, you know, we as marketers live and die by. And the other thing I just want to point out, and this is another thing that Matt Belloni mentioned in his newsletter, when you talk about a lot about sort of the idea that we're going to have to start showing the ability to actually make money and really prove and find your audience, he brought up the fact that there were two examples that he showcased when this was at HBO Max. You had Dune, which was an exclusive day and date release, right? And they made, I don't know, $400 million, and I don't know how much, I don't know what the total worldwide number was. But, and then they, you know, they're obviously in HBO Max, and probably may have driven subs a little bit, which was obviously Jason Kilar's, you know, main mission was to drive subs to HBO Max. And then you look at the Batman, right? Which opened, has made almost $800 million globally, and is killing it on HBO Max, supposedly. Now, again, we haven't seen the numbers, but look at the disparity in the numbers there. So it's like, you can still maybe the future is you can still have your cake and eat it too. You can still make gobs of money in theatrical.
Yeah.
And then still drive interaction on the platform, which has it exclusively, which is a case of HBO Max, in which case, it cuts out sort of the windowing with the HBOs and the Showtimes, and then it just goes exclusively to your streaming service there for a little bit, and then you potentially license it out to whatever your TNTs, TBSs, whatever.
To me, I think this is what I think the future should look like, or a version of this, right? Like, if I were Netflix or one of these streamers, I would be becoming buddy with exhibition. Let's take AMC and Netflix. Let's use them hypothetically, right? I would create a deal, like an actual partnership for these two supposed nemesis, right? Like, they shouldn't be. Yeah. I think they should create a deal where they work together to determine what goes in the theater and when, and what goes on the platform and when. And it doesn't just have to be movies anymore, right? Like, if you're Netflix and you're releasing Stranger Things, you have a partnership with AMC, and before you drop it on your platform, the weekend, the day you drop it, it's going to be in theaters, that weekend only, right?
Right.
And everyone can go see it in theaters, and everyone else can wait and see it. Like, that's what I think that's what I think people should be doing, right? I think that is interesting. And then you create demand back in theaters again, because it's an event. You don't just put any movie in there. You put specific projects that demand attendance.
Right.
Stranger Things is a good example. That doesn't have to be a movie. Game of Thrones, those last few episodes, that would have been a very interesting thing to do. Not just movies. And then also you have a movie like Batman, you release just in theaters at just this, on just this time. And then you can have your cake and eat it too, and go on streaming. And you create, you do what Stuber was saying, quality only, right? Quality only in theaters, or not even just quality, but event, right? Like, which ones create an event for someone? It has to be an event for someone, or it's an event for nobody.
Event for nobody.
Right? Famous Tony Sella.
That's true. Yeah.
How God knows how many years ago, but he's right. And so that's what I think an interesting partnership could look like. That's what I think we should be looking at. And it's not just one-offs; it's a full deal, and then they work together on a slate of what goes when, where.
Yeah, I mean, it does. That's a very smart way to look at it. And it's interesting because, this past week we had the famous CinemaCon in Las Vegas, which you and I have been to many of those. And we can share many horror tales of what it takes to put those presentations together, but we'll spare ourselves that PTSD and just talk about this year's. It's interesting you bring that up because, and I made this point in my newsletter, it infuriates me because we do this every year where, first of all, I was happy that they were actually able to have a full to-do and it wasn't scaled back or anything like that. So that's a great thing. But they continue to pretend like everything is hunky-dory. Like they're just like, hey, theaters are back, baby. We're back. And we don't have to change anything. And day and date simultaneous release is dead. And everyone knows it doesn't work. And and it's like no talking about the experience, which is still shitty. And half of these theaters are probably going to go under once all their COVID relief money runs out. And no talk about what you just said, like a partnership. And it's interesting to me that nobody wants to have that conversation. I love CinemaCon because obviously it's fun to see all the slates and everyone, brings out their presentation. And obviously you and I worked with Chris Aronson, who's always the consummate showman when it comes to CinemaCons. And I feel like he could almost, apparently from the stage at the Paramount presentation, he did say, like, let's try to make the experience. Let's limit the amount of trailers we show. Let's work together. So he started the conversation, which is great because that's what needs to happen if this is ever going to change. But I still think they're just blinkered and just blinded when there's this rare opportunity where there's an obvious reset. The 90-minute window's gone. 90-day window's gone. It's 45 days moving forward. Everyone's going to experiment and you're just going to have to learn to live with it. But why not do it in a partnership versus this constant adversarial relationship?
Right.
And it's interesting to me, like you look at some of the presentations, like obviously Sony's was Tom Rothman talking about how great Tom Rothman is and
Mhm.
how great their slate is, and woo, look at us. And
You know
they're
what?
and
Tom deserves those kudos.
I does he does
Through,
they
he made
weathered
it through
it.
the pandemic.
They weathered it, but he also sold off a lot of his movies to Netflix. So it's sort of like, again, it's one of those things where you celebrate theatrical, but at the same time, you're not ignoring, you're also ignoring the fact that there needs to be more of a partnership here versus just offloading to the streamer. And then you have some place like Warner Brothers, which again is sort of like, it's just hunky to everything's sort of normal. Like, here, let's trot out all these stars to get you guys all amped up and excited. Woo! Here's Dwayne Johnson. And it's just like, I mean, it's still avoiding the bigger question of this industry is sort of, we're on the Titanic right now, and we basically hit the iceberg. So you either need to figure out, let's get the lifeboats and get as many people on the lifeboats as possible.
Yeah.
Or we're just going to sit here and play the cello and the violin while we go down with the boat. Like, it infuriates me to no end that they just continually do this. And there's a moment here because Netflix has been sort of slapped back a little bit, and the sort of streaming of is the future and the only future is muddled, and they're just not taking advantage of it. And I just find it, it drives me nuts.
I totally agree. It's funny. I like your analogy of the Titanic, because it's funny because the reality of it too is like, I think of the door that Rose is on, and there's room for Jack on that door, right? So
the consummate Titanic debate.
The door is, Rose is Netflix and theatrical is Jack, and Jack, get on that door. Like, you can. There's room for you.
And, wait a minute. But to be fair, he did try, but then it started to sink. Remember? That was the big thing.
But he didn't even try again. He quit. He quit. And then he froze to death and sank to the bottom of the sea. And everyone cried. And everyone's sad because Jack is gone. So the thing is look, I don't think, and I've been saying this forever, theatrical's never going to go away. We just have to redefine it. And I think that's what, I mean, exhibition, they're just so old school in their thinking. And you're right. It was very frustrating to hear literally nothing new. It just felt like, they were kissing butt to all the exhibitors. You're the cornerstone of the industry. I think I heard cornerstone.
Well, after 17 days, I'm going to ship it off to Peacock. Oh, no, wait, here's Firestarter, a Stephen King movie, but I'm just going to put that on Peacock.
But this is
movies.
An opportunity. Yeah, this is an opportunity, and we should stop seeing each other as adversaries, and we should start seeing each other as partners. And this is a big, big opportunity. And I love that Chris tried to do that, Chris Aronson. And it doesn't surprise me that he tried to do it, because he's been talking about it for years and trying to find ways to partner together. And I think he's right. And I think Paramount, it was really smart at how they've been doing things. I mean, obviously it's showing from a box office standpoint, right? Yeah. At least this year. And I think, look, we need to change. We need to find these things. We need to find ways to work together. And once you start doing that, all it does is create more opportunity. Everyone wins. And that's the kind of stuff that we should be looking at. And we should really be scaling back budgets on certain movies, not every movie, but there's no ungodly reason why a comedy should cost over $50 million ever to make, right? You have there's certain movies that I have no idea when I see how big the budget is on why it should be that big. There's no reason for it. And when you do that, you put so much pressure on yourself to open, and you're never going to open north of that. So it's just, again, we have to, there's reasons why we have data. We have years and years and years and years of data on what works and what doesn't, and how we can create these models from a financial standpoint. And we should be paying attention to those more. And talking about those more, and having honest conversations with talent, and honest conversations with agents, and honest conversations with studios, and really standing our ground on certain things, because there's a reason for it. There's reasons why we should be doing that. There's no ungodly reason why some of it needs to be so expensive. Yeah. If you're not Avatar, if you're not Dune, and you don't need that money, right? You've got those movies that need it. They have to have that. And it shows. And you can really open it at the box office. Now, not every movie is going to open. Otherwise every movie would open, right? If we knew how to do it, if there was a special sauce, then every single movie would succeed. but that's
Yeah, I
business.
mean, yeah, I really hope that there's a realization of that, but I'm not, having been through so many of these presentations and witnessed so many of them up in person and sort of, read about them and written about them over the last few years.
Right.
I just don't sense that there's any sense of urgency. And I think it's going to take a moment. It's almost like, in New York City, when nobody really did anything until the city was basically on the verge of bankruptcy and total collapse. And then somebody's like, well, maybe one party rule isn't a good idea for the last 40 years. So let's try this former prosecutor. And then all of a sudden things get cleaned up. And it's almost like, I think something like that needs to happen, where there needs to be a complete crisis where a lot of theaters go under. And then they're going to be like, okay, now we got to figure out how we're going to make this work.
Well, the crisis has already happened.
Yes.
And now all it takes, the new disruptor, is one person who is in a position of authority and power to come in and make that deal that I just said. Partner with a streamer and partner with exhibition.
Or
that.
Yeah. Or better yet, buy a theater.
Not just one theater.
No, I'm not saying buy, but if a lot of these theaters are going to go under, then you buy some and then you partner with a Netflix. And then you're like, hey, Netflix, you can come into our theater and show your first couple showings of Stranger Things. At least gets people in our new experience theater.
You could do that, but that takes time. That takes more money. What I'm talking about doesn't. Mine is plug and play. Plug and play, baby. Get that partnership going. Work together. We're friends. Let's make money together.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, but again, I think there's a lot of animosity going years back that I think will have to be iced over, and people have to move on.
That's why all it takes is two people, one on each side.
You're right. And listen, I think Brian Robbins surprised a lot of people with his commitment to theatrical at CinemaCon, because everybody thought he was coming in and just going to dump everything on streaming, and clearly that's not the case. And right now, you're right. What it looks like they're doing is working. So, well, listen, Robin, I could talk about this till I'm blue in the face, as I'm sure you could too, but our listeners and viewers don't necessarily have more than 30 minutes in a day to devote to our expounding on the industry. So thank you again for joining me. Great to have you. Always a pleasure. For those of you who are listening and watching, please be sure to subscribe on whatever podcast channel you happen to do your podcasting. Good news is Tim will be here next week, so be sure to schedule it in your calendars. And throughout the next few months, I think Robin may be joining us a couple more times as our co-host, because my usual co-host Tim will be doing some traveling this summer, so he may be in and out as we go, but we'll be always glad to have Robin to step into his big shoes, as it were. So thanks.
Step in those shoes. I'll do my best.
Exactly. So thanks again, Robin. Appreciate having you. Thanks again to our background team, Lydia and Michelle, for helping us put together the show. And we couldn't do it without you guys. So thanks again. And thank you all for listening and watching. And we'll see you here next week.